Fostering Development, Not Displacement, an ethical analysis of responses to food gentrification-induced displacement. To address the injustices of community displacement induced by food gentrification, we propose empowering communities towards autonomy over their own development efforts through participatory democracy and community land trusts.
As cities and communities respond to food inequality, patterns of gentrification have caused unjust harms that violate three central capabilities of bodily health, affiliation, and control over one's environment. Where epistemic injustice and disempowerment have excluded and displaced vulnerable communities, particularly low-income residents and people of color, community developments have induced structural drivers of exclusion and oppression. Empowering local communities is possible and necessary to address these injustices. Revitalization of food systems and communities does not have to come at the cost of displacement. This story can have a different outcome without making the situation worse or doing more harm. Thus, we argue it is an ethical responsibility to address the consequences of food gentrification. A contractualist ethical argument would weigh interpersonal burdens. When development and revitalization overlook basic protections of residents and displace them from homes, community residents can reasonably reject the processes of gentrification, even though it may benefit an affluent person enjoying amenities such as farmers markets, Whole Foods, or gardens. We agree community improvements are valuable, but there will be greater harms and consequences of a displaced individual that could reject prioritizing the complaints of its counterpart. As a result, it is worth doing something about the current unjust arrangements. Food injustice is a complex, multifaceted issue that requires a critical and thoughtful evaluation to empower resilient communities to actively engage in development efforts that provide immediate improvements in food access while addressing larger structural inequalities. The following recommendations are not all-inclusive and they alone cannot do everything necessary. However, they are one path forward worth reducing harms and promoting the dignity of human beings.
Participatory governance is a model of community decision-making that involves traditional political processes like voting, but extends further to include direct engagement with community issues through open discussion and public decision-making. Central to this is the goal of empowerment. Instead of solely addressing the immediate needs of people experiencing injustices, this method of governance hopes to develop people's abilities to directly influence policies and decisions that affect their communities. As pertains to the alleviation of food inequalities and increasing accessibility, this model could be used to ensure that both the needs and desires of local residents have weight in the decision-making process. If community members are concerned about experiencing the effects of gentrification, driving displacement, or stripping them of their autonomy, having a say in what the development of new infrastructure such as community gardens or grocery stores would look like will allow these developing spaces to more accurately represent the community than if decisions are made through external leadership. Under Iris Marion Young's model of deliberative democracy, decisions are only legitimate if those affected by outcomes have a say in the deliberation. Under such conditions, the dignity of each individual is respected as they are viewed as ends in themselves for whom the effects of decisions on personal well-being have value. Participatory governance is not simply about including community members as token voices. Rather, this form of engagement aims to hear people for the sake of valuing them as knowers and experts on their own environment. At a public meeting in Harlem, the Harlem Community Development Corporation aimed to engage with community members in discussion about a proposal to improve city parks. Although the board expected to receive mostly positive feedback and think about ways to move the project forward, residents expressed reticence over who truly stood to profit from this development and who might experience harm, specifically citing the loss of recognized community spaces. Without community members being able to voice concerns, decisions about the development in this space might have been made that would violate the interests of those most affected. A concern that might arise surrounds who would have access to participation in co-governance and what that participation might look like. For individuals who work long hours, lack access to transportation, or cannot afford childcare, asking them to take time to attend meetings or engage in public discussions may simply not be practical. Compounding this, those least able to engage might be the very people most at risk of suffering harms of gentrification-driven displacement and food apartheid, thus deepening the injustice by excluding their voices from conversations that affect them. Additionally, participation might run the risk of looking like epistemic exploitation if certain people are expected to share on a level that extends beyond what they would choose. Concern for inequality in access to participation is not without significance. In response, highlighting the power of fostering healthy relationships within communities and between residents and organizers is critical. If this occurs, the thoughts, opinions, and desires of community members unable to attend formal meetings will still be understood and heard by those who may have more involvement in the decision-making process. Respecting people as knowers is not only important in formal situations of policy making, but also in hearing people's thoughts is valuable in daily conversation. Implementing a participatory democracy model to more adequately align with how the community hopes to experience improvements in food access will alleviate harms of displacement and inaccess and protect people's right to exercise agency over their environment in ways that maintaining current systems of government are unable to. Avoiding exploitation of voices might include careful consideration and the transparency about how residents can engage and explicit statements of the voluntary nature of their participation.
As a more direct implementation of community participation, community land trusts, or CLTs, serve as a form of shared equity home ownership. They can directly address the growing affordability gap in housing by maintaining long-term affordable prices and building community resilience in rapidly gentrifying cities, even with cultural and economic disruptions. This solution offers more opportunities to modest home ownership, which empowers people to invest in their properties and community amenities, and offers stability against the vicious cycle of poverty. A study by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy found that 95% of CLT's homes are affordable to households who earn 80% of the area median income, and nearly half the homes are affordable to very low-income households earning up to 50% of the AMI. Furthermore, CLT's governing boards enhance social cohesion and racial equity by ensuring representation of more stakeholders. As we learned through the social structural analysis, food injustice and displacement by processes of gentrification disproportionately affect people of color. Community land trusts have the opportunity to improve equitable wealth building, and over the last 2 decades across the U.S., they have led to an increase in homeowners who are people of color by over 30%. We recommend government subsidies, grants, and community enhancement donations be allocated to CLT nonprofit groups to buy the land with the ability to ensure that it stays affordable over long periods of time. The land is owned by the CLT, but individual homes are sold to low-income families. The model protects against developers and investors buying and exploiting cheap, affordable land in struggling neighborhoods, and further, it essentially allows a community development union to form where the neighborhood as a collective can be involved in understanding and representing the interests of one another and the businesses that will come into this space. It is not just a zoning restriction to keep developers out, because we understand that development does offer benefits too, but it must be thoughtful of the integration and inclusion of those who it will directly affect so as not to exploit those vulnerable to the structures of racial capitalism and food apartheid. In Oakland, California, where sociologist Allison Hope Alkin has focused deeply on the intersections of food justice and gentrification amid dramatic fluctuations in land value, there is a CLT project with the motivating principle of community justice. The Oakland model is composed of 1/3 residents and leasees of OCLT properties, 1/3 of community members from the neighborhood not living in an OCLT property, and the final third is made up of technical experts and representatives from local organizations who share OCLT's mission. The organization works to foster leadership and build community power through an engaged board to ensure mindful development and stewardship, whether for growing food, distributing food, or accessible housing. Informational and educational initiatives also increase access for community members to apply for buying an OCL house, promoting their development without displacement and investment without disenfranchisement. An ethical objection may be raised about the prioritization of spending and expenses of CLTs as opposed to using that government funding for immediate food insecurity needs. In gentrifying neighborhoods that displace low-income residents, one could argue we should not prioritize attention to the neighborhood now gaining those amenities, but rather focus on the areas where people have been displaced to, where food and nutritional deficits are likely to continue, and spend money on meeting immediate and necessary food needs. CLTs cannot occur in isolation or as an alternative from these other urgent responses, but we emphasize also seeking action on the systemic root causes that span generational injustice and disempowerment from the land itself. Without considering the upstream factors of food injustice through critical intersectional pathways of housing developments and neighborhood structures, food gentrification will remain exclusive to only the privileged group. Therefore, we assert investments in property and housing infrastructure is just one necessary response among many for attaining structures for accessible, equitable food justice projects. Another concern that has been raised about community land trusts is the cap on resale profits. As opposed to alternative affordable housing with resale restrictions, potential buyers may be hesitant about the limited profit potential of a CLT. While this may be true, other affordable housing policies, such as rent controls or linkage fees, can be more counterproductive by actually disincentivizing property owners to make improvements of their community amenities, and in addition to not profiting on resale, residents may be left with affordable housing that sacrifices stagnant or even deteriorating conditions, perpetuating structural injustices and deficits in social determinants of health. When presented with the alternative of the arrangements of displacement by gentrification, the prospective improvements by CLTs, even if limited profit margins, will protect against more harmful individual consequences, harms that can be avoided. Our goal is to do more good than harm, to improve the conditions of residential areas that accompany food gentrification. Without CLTs as an option, families may have no choice but to be priced out of these gentrifying regions and face continued structural harms and burdens that can be reasonably rejected. Prospective homeowners would still have a choice, so there is no obligation to buy into a CLT home if those caps on resale are undesirable, but for community members who do need this option without an alternative, it will provide greater security and stability than otherwise. We cannot be paralyzed by perfection as the enemy of good. Finding steps that are worth investing in the people and their community structures will enable greater capabilities and structures of resilience.